Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the webinar series on the sleep and health. This session will last 2 hours from 1:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon here in the UK. And today we will hear 4 world-leading experts in the field of sleep and health. First, we will have Felicity Waite, who will talk about how to treat sleep problems in patients with psychosis. Then this will follow by Professor Tandam Wu, who will talk about the neural mechanisms and clinical implications of sleep and cognitive health. Then Dr. Sofia Eriksson will present her work on sleep and epilepsy. And finally, we will end this webinar with a presentation of Professor Mark Wisburg, who will talk about sleep and mental health in children. As happened last week, so each speaker presentation will last 20 minutes. And after each of the presentation of the speaker, we will have 10 minutes for Q&A. And during each of the talks, so you can leave your questions in the Q&A section, and then we will read all the questions that is possible at the end of each talk, and the speaker will have the opportunity to answer to each of them during the 10 minutes. Also, you can raise your hand on Zoom during the Q&A section if there is still time for more questions. And although, well, I'm aware that more people are joining now, but anyways, I will start already introducing the first speaker, and we will start with the presentations of the webinar. I'm introducing, so it's a real pleasure for me to introduce all of you Felicity Waite. So thank you very much, Felicity, for joining this webinar today. Felicity is clinical research psychologist at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford. She's the deputy lead of the Oxford Cognitive Approach to Psychosis and a Wellcome clinical doctoral research fellow. Felicity leads the SleepWell trial, which investigates if treating sleep problems can prevent the onset of serious mental health problems in young people, and has been previously involved in other projects testing psychological intervention targeting sleep. So she's really here the expert of sleep intervention in psychosis. So she's like an ideal speaker for this talk. Today, Felicity will describe developments in understanding the nature, causal role, and psychological treatment of sleep disruption in patients with psychosis. So thanks again, Felicity, for joining us today. And now, whenever you are ready, you can start with your presentation. You have 20 minutes, and after that, we will have 10 minutes for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much as well. Thank you for the wonderful invitation to join so many people thinking together about sleep this afternoon. That's a real pleasure to get together. So I'll just share a few slides with you as we begin to think a little bit about sleep disruption, in particular in patients with psychosis. So sleep problems for patients with psychosis are common. This is a common clinical issue, and yet for so long it has been overlooked. And perhaps that's because historically we've thought that sleep problems were a secondary consequence of the psychotic experiences. Whereas what I'm going to talk us through today is this whole shift in understanding that over the last 10 years of research, we've really begun to see the picture differently. And this is really important because actually the sleep disruption plays a causal role in the occurrence of psychotic experiences like paranoid thoughts and hallucinations, hearing voices or seeing things that others don't. And this matters because not only is this a common clinical problem, but it's one that patients want help for. And we actually do have a treatment, which is wonderful news. We have CBT for insomnia, which has been evidenced in over 100 randomized controlled trials with patients with insomnia. So we have really good stand from which to begin to develop the treatment. And because of the causal role of the sleep problems onto other mental health problems, not only do people sleep better, but they get knock-on benefits too. So that's what we're going to talk through today. It'll be a pleasure to do that. So let's start with hearing from one of our patients. This is what one of the people we've been working with said. I would just sleep through the day, and that put a massive strain on my social life, my mood and mental health. It turned my life the other way around. I'd be up at night and then I wouldn't be up in the day. I wouldn't go out and see people because I was sleeping. I think it was very unhealthy. So patients recognize the problem. They see and feel the effects of sleep problems. And yet this is not a one-off. In a survey that we conducted with around 1,800 patients in NHS mental health services, patients with psychosis, this was 1,800 patients with psychosis, what we found is 50% met criteria for insomnia. This was just using a brief screening tool and the self-report of patients' sleep problems. So around half of patients with psychosis are experiencing insomnia. And actually, when we get into doing more structured clinical interviews and doing a more accurate and thorough assessment of sleep problems, what we found is that the numbers increase. It was around 8 out of 10 people in an early intervention psychosis service with first episode psychosis were screening positive for a sleep disorder. And of those, around 4 out of 5 had more than one sleep problem. What this is telling us is that it goes beyond insomnia and that sleep problems are common and complex. And yet, despite this, sleep problems are often overlooked. In fact, only half of patients have spoken with a mental health professional about their sleep, and only a third had had any kind of treatment. And importantly, most often this treatment was not the recommended. People typically were being given either a single sheet of sleep hygiene tips or were having changes in their antipsychotic medication, neither of which are the evidence-based treatments for sleep problems. So what are the problems that patients face? The two most common are insomnia and nightmare disorder. Both around the 50% of patients with psychosis experience these. So let's hear what patients say. This is what one person with insomnia said. I used to lay in bed for hours and hours. I couldn't sleep. I used to sit and worry all night. I used to use that as my worry time. I didn't get much sleep. Well, I did, but I used to sleep during the day and I never used to be out of bed before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. When I did sleep, I used to sleep too much during the day. So I'd get to sleep late and then sleep all day, or I wouldn't sleep enough, or I'd just completely not sleep at all and stay awake the whole time. I just used to look like a zombie all the time. I used to make stupid mistakes over stupid little things. And everyone around me noticed either I was in bed and wasn't around, or I just used to look like a zombie. I think this account is incredibly powerful. Within this one few lines from one person, what we can see is the difficulties getting to sleep, staying asleep and waking up too early. That's the insomnia problems. We can see the nighttime worry, but we can also see the knock-on impact on circadian rhythm disruption, with people having that shifted pattern in their sleep, sleeping too late. Also, we can see the impact on daytime functioning and on social relationships. So we can see the complexity of the sleep problem here. Let's hear from someone else about their experience of nightmares. I woke up feeling anxious and guilty. I felt tense, clammy, and my heart would be beating fast. And then the people you see in the daytime, they're in your nightmares. And even though you know it's not real, it still really affects you. I felt like my whole life was a mess. I felt as if I'd been having a really bad time, when in fact, it was just a dream. For patients with psychosis, often experiencing paranoid fears, those beliefs that others intend to cause them harm, or experiencing hearing negative, critical, derogatory voices, actually those same fears are playing out in the nighttime just as they are in the daytime. And although we all know our dreams, no matter how good or bad, we know they're not real. Actually, they leave us with a really big emotional impact. And I don't know if it's just me, but I've certainly had times where I've woken up from a dream and dreamt that someone's done something really annoying. And even though I know they haven't, I'm certainly still a little bit irritated with them the next day, because we know that even though dreams aren't real, we carry the sense of affect from them into the day. And for patients where their dreams are frightening and scary and carry a sense of threat, that then feeds the daytime sense of threat and fears that people are living under. So patients are telling us a lot about their sleep problems. And one thing that is most important is that there is a clear desire for treatment. In our survey with 1,800 patients with psychosis in NHS services, 3/4 were saying they would like help to improve their sleep. So if it's common and clinicians recognise it and patients recognise it, why is it being overlooked? Well, perhaps that's because traditionally sleep problems in patients with psychosis were considered to be this secondary consequence, that if you're feeling very paranoid and fearful, or if you're low in mood or very anxious and on edge, or you're hearing voices or seeing things that others don't, it's understandable that your sleep would be disrupted by that. And so it was seen as this secondary consequence, and therefore not the focus of where we should be intervening. And yet, over recent years, we've seen this shift in understanding, where we're now beginning to see that sleep disruption itself can be a causal factor in the occurrence of psychotic symptoms and other mental health problems. So Sarah Reeve, who's conducted a fantastic PhD examining sleep and psychotic experiences, really took on this challenge of reviewing the literature. And I think she had no date limits and found around 60 studies. And then we ran a quick update just 5 years later and found another 60. So it's incredible the increase of interest in this area. And what both of these reviews were showing is that actually we're beginning to see the importance of sleep disruption, that it is a causal contributor to the occurrence of the psychotic-like experiences. And actually within a network model's perspective, it's the causally connected yet previously overlooked non-specific factors that carry the weight. They're the potentially influential treatment targets within networks of psychiatric symptoms. That means they become targets for treatment. And these reviews, there was a third review led by Daniel Freeman published in the Lancet Psychiatry, and this was showing that actually it's not just in psychotic symptoms, but actually across mental health disorders. And importantly, what this review highlights is that if there is a causal relationship, then treating insomnia may in fact lessen other mental health problems. And perhaps interventions on sleep at an early stage may even be a preventative strategy for the onset of clinical disorders. But of course, how do we know this is causation and not just correlation? Well, of course, there are two ways to test this. The first is you can deprive people of sleep. See what happens when we mean that people have less sleep than usual, and what happens. Sarah Reeve conducted an experimental test where she restricted students' sleep to just 4 hours a night. And sadly, this was not restricting it because they were out having a good time or even studying extra hard. She was keeping them awake on purpose to find out what would happen. And she saw an increase in negative affect, negative self-beliefs, worry and memory problems. And crucially, she saw an increase in paranoia and hallucinations. And it was the changes in psychotic experiences were mediated by the negative affect. So it looks like when you get that knock on the mood and worry and negative self, that's the route to them seeing an impact and an increase in psychotic-like experiences. But there's another way of testing the causation, perhaps the kinder way, which is to take people with some sleep problems and see what happens if you get them to sleep better and you improve their sleep, what happens to the other mental health symptoms. So in a study with around 3,500 students, we completed an experimental test offering a treatment. This is a causal interventionist approach to testing out experimental design. It means that we can treat the problem and see if there's a benefit on the potential causal mechanism. So what we were able to see at such a large scale is that when you reduce the insomnia, you also saw reductions in paranoid and hallucinatory experiences. And it was the changes in sleep which mediated changes in paranoid and hallucinations. But of course, although a very large scale study, this was not with patients with psychosis, this was with university students, some of whom will have had some psychotic-like experiences, because psychotic-like experiences occur on a continuum throughout the general population. So we've also conducted a number of studies with clinical patients. Now, in all of these, it tends to be a much smaller project with much smaller sample size, but the picture across each of the studies is really consistent. What we see is a very high uptake of treatment. Patients want the help and they attend the therapy. and we see large effect size improvements in sleep. And interestingly here, we see these knock-on benefits across the network of psychopathology. That means that we're beginning to get this understanding that when we get large effect size improvements in sleep, we get medium effect size improvements in mood, and small but important effect size improvements in psychotic experiences. And there are other benefits too. We see that actually for patients where they've often faced very long-term problems, where things have been complicated and life has got stuck, actually being able to get a good night's sleep can really help them have the resilience to be able to face other challenges in the psychological therapy work going forward. And of course, being able to sleep well allows us to engage in the daytime activity. Sleep problems are not just a problem for night. The main way that we experience the sleep problem is that it disrupts our daytime lives. And so if people have the goal of getting back to work, being able to engage more in day-to-day life, tackling sleep is a crucial part of that. And we also know that sleep is often a particularly risky time. There's fewer people around to help and fewer resources at hand. And therefore we want to think about treating sleep problems as a route to helping people stay safe. So what did patients say at the end of therapy? This is what one person said. I now have the energy to do those things that I normally wouldn't have done because I was physically just too tired. And it makes me feel happy because I'm getting stuff done. I'm not getting stressed out. It makes me feel happier. And to be honest, when we're offering treatments for patients, it feels pretty good when they leave the session and they actually feel happier. That's a great outcome that we want to see for patients. So how do we do this? We're going to spend the next kind of section of the talk just thinking about what are the treatments and how do we get there. So the guidance from NICE is pretty clear. Insomnia should be treated, if the insomnia persists for more than 4 weeks, it should be treated with a cognitive behavioural therapy intervention. And to understand how the CBT works, it's really helpful for us to just focus on what drives our sleep, understanding the mechanisms about what contributes to sleep and sleep disruption first. So there are 3 processes that we want to consider here. The first is sleep pressure. This is our need for or propensity to sleep, and this increases with the longer that we've been awake. And you can see that here in the graph, that the longer we're awake, our need for sleep increases. The second process is our circadian rhythms, or our body clock. This is our 24-hour cycle that our body is on, and we want this to be aligned with the day and night so that we're awake and alert during daytime and able to sleep at nighttime. And in fact, every single cell in your body has a clock gene in it, and so there are peak times for your body to be doing each of its different processes throughout the 24-hour cycle. And for those of you who are looking to perhaps, you know, break a personal record or get a PB in your fitness goals, then the best time to be doing that is about 5 o'clock. So you've still got time to do it today, and you'll get your very best chances of getting a PB. So these 2 processes interact. What we see is the need for sleep, that sleep drive, we want that to peak just at the moment where our body's circadian cycle is ready for us to drift off to sleep at nighttime. And that's the ideal. And either one of these 2 can be disrupted, but there is a third important factor for us to consider. And that's our levels of hyperarousal. Because if we are on edge, or literally on the edge, it's not safe for us to get to sleep. And so our body's alerting system will keep us awake. And that means that we're not going to be able to get off to sleep, even if we have sleep drive and our circadian systems are aligned. And there are many factors that increase hyperarousal or anxiety. It could be anxiety from worries, you know, having to do a presentation at work the next day might be playing on our mind at night. There might be other things that are going on. But for patients with psychosis, actually, the levels of hyperarousal are particularly increased. Patients may be hearing voices, feeling fearful that they're under threat at night. And of course, we therefore want to be able to think about this key aspect of hyperarousal. So there are these three processes become three targets for the treatment. And in each of these, we want to think about the three key aspects of the treatment. We want to set the sleep window to anchor the circadian rhythm. We want to rise up for an active day in order to build sleep pressure for night. And we want to wind down for sleep so that we reduce the levels of hyperarousal, because we need to feel calm and safe to get off to sleep and stay asleep throughout the night. But there is a need for adaptation of this for patients with psychosis. And here are three challenges. The first is the scale of environmental change needed. When we think about setting the sleep window, we actually firstly need to check, does the person have a bed? Do they have curtains? Do they have, or blinds? Do they have a space that actually can allow them to get off to sleep? Too often patients require a huge scale of environmental change before it's possible to begin doing the other work. Many of our patients actually sleep on the sofa. They spend most of their day there and the night too. So we must attend to the environment first. And what we talk about is setting the scene for sleep. And that means getting the timing right and anchored, but also stacking the odds in favor of good sleep by making sure we've got the environment set up right. The second key challenge is the complete, often, poverty of activity and isolation that patients with psychosis face. For most of us, sleep problems are worrying to us because they're going to have an impact on our functioning the next day. And yet, for too many patients with psychosis, the diary is empty. In fact, friendship networks are reduced on average to just 1.6 friends. And patients with psychosis have levels of anxious avoidance at the rate of agoraphobia, so are staying in home all day. And that's around 80% of patients would meet that criteria for agoraphobia. And understandably, then most of the day is spent in sedentary behaviour. People are sitting or lying for more than 14 hours of the waking day. So this poverty of activity and isolation requires us to make adaptations. So we talk about a 24-hour problem requires a 24-hour solution. We want to get a really clear rise up routine in place that helps us to build up the reasons to get up and going in the day. Otherwise, if most of us are honest, maybe we wouldn't have been quite so quick to get out of bed this morning if we didn't have to get up and active. We need to increase activity. We need to add things to the diary to increase not only the sleep pressure at night, but also the happiness, the connection, the things that matter for people. And of course, to do all of that, we need to boost up motivation. And another key challenge is thinking about these levels of hyperarousal. Perhaps it's specifically hearing voices or having paranoid fears that is disrupting sleep at night. And so we need to help people feel calm and safe to sleep. That means tackling the wind down routine, making sure people are only associating bed with sleep, and beginning to reduce nighttime waking by feeling calm and safe before sleep and being able to bring that down in the night too. So these key challenges require adaptation. We need to think about the sleep environment and scale of change that may be needed. We need to address the poverty of activity and isolation that patients face. We need to think about hyperarousal due to psychotic experiences. And so each of these treatment strategies that are common to CBT for insomnia may require adaptation because of the occurrence of psychotic experiences that run as a central thread throughout the intervention. But very often we find we can make great progress getting the sleep in place first, and then only addressing psychotic experiences much later down the road with the intervention. So in our treatments, in around 6 to 8 sessions, we see large effect size improvements in sleep in patients with psychosis. Patients want the treatment and they stick with it. I wanted to finish with saying a little bit about some of the things people have said about their experiences of the therapy from some of the patients who've taken part. So firstly, just to say, most people don't expect this to work at first. And so for us as practitioners, it's our responsibility to hold the hope and expectation and help people make that change. And it's understandable that actually, of course, if people have been facing problems for a long time, of course, they're not expecting it to work. And yet, even though they didn't think it would work at first, people found that they learned a lot about sleep and actually developed a repertoire of skills. It was about trying things out. And one of the patients I worked with said, oh, CBT it's described as a talking therapy, but really it's a trying and doing therapy. And I really like that description because it's about trying things out, doing things differently. And I think that really captures the essence of this work. And people found it incredibly useful. They said, actually, everything has kind of all eased up at the same time. It's so highly linked with sleep. When I sleep better, I have a better day. It's helped my anxiety and I'm better able to cope with situations. And that's all because I've been gaining control of my sleep. And some people even enjoyed the therapy, which is great to hear too. So we know that sleep problems are common and that they are a causal factor in the occurrence of psychotic experiences. And if we can treat them in patients with psychosis, what does this mean for those young people who are at the highest risk of developing psychotic experiences? Because if we're actually able to address the sleep problems early, could that be a preventative intervention for the onset of clinical disorders? That's what we want to find out in the SleepWell project, which is a feasibility randomized control trial with 40 young people aged 14 to 25. And we're treating their sleep problems to see if we can not only improve sleep, but also reduce the psychotic-like experiences. So sleep problems in patients with psychosis are common, they're complex, and they have a causal role. We have a treatment that works for a problem that patients want treated, and there are potential knock-on benefits for mental health too. So it just goes for me to say a huge thanks to the many inspiring colleagues that has been an absolute privilege to work with. And of course, my chance to say thank you and sleep well.
Thank you, Felicity. I mean, yeah, I was clapping from here. So, I mean, for such an excellent presentation and so detailed, I think, like covering like all the important aspects of, I mean, I learned a lot of all the sleep intervention in psychosis. So we have like a very short time for the Q&A. I have so many questions, but I will discuss with you at some point. We have to have a long meeting about this. And so there was a Q&A. There was a question in the beginning, so maybe this has been already answered during your talk. From Anya, she asked, do you think psychosis causes a sleep disruption, or is it the sleep disruption that causes psychosis? So yeah, I think, well, if you want just briefly with one sentence, I think it's been one of the main points of your
we can see that, of course, this is a bidirectional relationship, so we can see that we've found the causal evidence that sleep disruption can be one of the causal contributory factors to the occurrence of psychotic experiences. And of course, also, if someone is having distressing psychotic experiences, it's likely to disrupt their sleep too. So yes, both of those are right. And thanks for your question.
And then we have at least two questions from Hoyen Tan. So the first one, yes, I heard that in medical school they get around 2 hours of sleep education. Has it changed? If not, why? To me, it doesn't make sense why there is little sleep education, as we spend around 1/3 of our life sleeping with much display. It's important. So I guess it's related to. And then the other question I just got together is there a particular demographic that is more susceptible to insomnia?
I think we're all, probably everyone on the call agrees about the importance of sleep and that recognition that, yeah, we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep. And of course, when we don't sleep well, there are very clear consequences on our physical health, on our mental health, on our cognition and learning abilities too. And yet, it seems to be really overlooked in our training as clinicians. There have been a couple of studies that have surveyed this, and it does look like there's quite a range, with most school medical training facilities, or I'm a clinical psychologist, so training clinical psychology, having just an hour or two of training, whereas others can have up to around 19 hours, I think is the most that was recorded for this. And I guess it's on all of us to advocate for this and to try and do some change. There has been some really wonderful work and specific training programs that have been set up here in the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute in Oxford, that have been led really by fantastic work from Colin Espy and Simon Kyle. So there is some really great training around, but it would be great to see this much better embedded. I definitely felt like I didn't get enough training on this for myself, and have really had to go about trying to learn this. So it'd be great if we can club together and think how we can make that change happen.
Yes, so I guess, and as well, this is one of the efforts as well, right? Like to highlight the relevance of sleep and mental health and health in general. So step by step, little by little, we will get there. So I think, well, this is like, we are just done with this part of the webinar. Thanks a lot, Felicity, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And yeah, let's keep in touch.
Thanks so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
And now is the turn of Professor Tan Dambu. I think you are here, Tan. Yeah, hello.
Yes,
good morning.
Good morning. Good morning from Montreal. Hello, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and that's it. So you are joining us from Montreal, so as well like this extra effort to adapt to our like different time points. So now Professor Andy Balshaw, he will introduce you to everyone, and then he will lead as well the Q&A for you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Isabel, and thanks, Tan, for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here. So Tan is Professor and Concordia University Research Chair in Sleep Neuroimaging and Cognitive Health. He's also a neurologist and clinically trained, and today he's going to review some of the work he's been doing over the last few years, looking at the relationship between brain rhythms during sleep, memory consolidation, age-related cognitive decline, and looking at the impact of sleep disturbances on cognitive functions and sleep-related interventions for memory performance. So Tan has done a lot of work in sleep, and it's a real pleasure to have him here today.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Should I go? Should I start?
Yes, please do. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Andy, for the kind introduction. Thank you to both of you, Isabel and Andy, for organizing this seminar and having me among this very distinguished panel of speakers. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and present some of the works we've been doing over the past few years. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it's going to work. Okay, so I can put it in full mode. So can you see it?
It's in presenter mode, I think. So
okay, so I had this problem the other, maybe if I okay, like this.
That's better. Yeah, that looks fine.
Okay, that looks fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about sleep and cognitive health, and both from the neuromechanisms perspective and also from the clinical perspective. And this is basically the outline of my talk. So first, I'm going to discuss some studies we did to better understand the neuromechanisms underlying sleep's role in cognitive health, particularly on focusing on spindles and also on measures of brain function integration. Then I'm going to discuss some work we've been doing on people with insomnia disorders and how this affects cognitive functions. And I will finish with some of the more interventions work where we have some trials looking at the effect of CBTI on sleep and cognition, and also looking at the interaction between sleep and physical activity. So as probably most of you know, human sleep is comprised of different stages that occur through the night in sleep cycles, and 75% of our sleep time is constituted by non-rapid eye movement sleep. And on the left side, you have stage 2 and stage 3 in particular, which are defined by specific oscillations on the EEG. And we know that those oscillations are particularly important for the role of sleep in cognitive functions, particularly in memory consolidation. So has been modeled by a couple of researchers and with increasing number of findings that supported. Memory consolidation during sleep involves interplay between different regions, and it seems that brain oscillations, such as slow oscillation of sleep spindles in particular, facilitate the interplay and the transfer of information from hippocampus to the neocortex. And some studies have shown, for example, that sleep spindles and in certain phases of slow oscillations might be a drive for transfer of some type of information from the hippocampus to the neocortex and underlying the consolidation of memory traces. So this is a study we conducted some long time ago already, but that we published 2 years ago. These were studies that actually were acquired back in Belgium and we re-analyzed here in Montreal. So in that study, we wanted to probe whether spindles would be associated with this replay or reactivation of information that are in reactivation of regions that are involved in learning new information. So this is a study in which people slept in the fMRI scanner, EEG, simultaneously during 2 nights. And prior to their sleep in the scanner, they were scanned during learning a task. And this task was a hippocampal dependent task consisting of learning sequences of phase. And people were instructed to reorder the order phases right after learning and also after the sleep session. And so this protocol consisted of 2 nights, and between the 2 nights, separated by 1 week, people came back to the lab to learn the task intensively every day in such a way that during the 8th night, when they were submitted to the same protocol, they were exposed to the exact same material, but without new information to be learned. So this night 8 served as the control night. And basically what we were looking at was the comparison between the learning night and the control night in terms of regions, in terms of brain activations associated with learning, associated with sleep spindles and recall, with the hypothesis that during sleep spindles after learning, there would be higher activation of regions involved in prior learning, and therefore supporting the idea of spindles mediating the offline consolidation of memory traces. So these are the results for the encoding of the task, where you see that during encoding, people activated some regions of the occipital cortex, particularly the fusiform face area, in back in the brain, and so also some region of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, when people were recalling the task, the memories, we also observed some reactivation of the same regions in proportion of the amount of information that was successfully remembered across after sleep. But interestingly, when we looked at the comparison between sleep spindles and particularly comparing fast spindles to slow spindles, so you probably wonder why we did this contrast, is because we wanted to basically control for the baseline activity during these sleep sessions. So we had to subtract it by doing a comparison of fast spindle activity to slow spindle activity. That made sense because fast spindles are those that are the most associated with learning and memory consolidation of declarative memories. What we observed during this fast to slow spindle comparison during sleep after learning compared to sleep during the control night, we observe a high activation in the region of the fusiform gyrus that was found activated, as well as the thalamus that is known to be involved in the generation of sleep spindles, which is in support of our hypothesis that there is truly a reactivation after learning of information in synchrony with sleep spindles. And so very interestingly, when we're looking at the regions in this contrast that were modulated by performance, so the better they recalled memories after sleep, the more during spindles they reactivated the hippocampus, which is truly also in line with our model that is this interplay with hippocampus and neocortex in association with sleep spindles. This figure shows you the overlap between those different contrasts. So in red, brain response associated with learning, in blue, those associated with spindles, and in yellow or green, those associated with recall. And you see this nice overlap over the fusiform gyrus, showing this this replay of information in these regions across the different steps of the consolidation process. So this study was an example of how we can support the idea of this triple interaction model between slow wave spindles and hippocampus in the offline consolidation of memory traces. So then in the next slides, I'm going to show you a study that we conducted in Montreal together with my collaborator Christophe Grovam, and this is an analysis, a paper that was published very recently by my postdoc Nathan Cross. And what we did in that study was to look at the effect of sleep deprivation and recovery nap on brain function during cognitive tasks. And this was a protocol in which subjects, healthy adults, came to the lab and were scanned in different conditions. During one session, they had a full night of sleep, and in the morning they were scanned during cognitive tasks. And in the other session, separated by 7 days, in a counterbalance order, they came to the lab, but then they were sleep deprived and monitored during the whole night and scanned after sleep deprivation using the same task. Then during the same scanning session, they had a 60-minute nap opportunity in the scanner. And after that 16-minute nap opportunity, they were scanned again during the same task after that recovery nap. In such a way that we were able to compare brain activity in a well-rested condition, sleep-deprived condition, and recovered condition after sleep. And the whole idea was to basically characterize not only the effect of sleep deprivation and recovery on behavioral performances, but most importantly, the effect on brain function, particularly on different measures of connectivity. And I'm going to show you what we use in that particular protocol. And so in terms of tasks, we use tasks that assessed domains that were commonly known to be affected in sleep deprivation. So working memory with the and-back task, attention and executive function with the ANT task, and vigilance with the PVT task. And so, yeah, so I'm not going to show you the behavioral results, but not surprisingly, we observed that performance, both in terms of accuracy and reaction times, was impaired after sleep deprivation across tasks, and was recovered after the recovery nap to some extent closer to the level that was achieved during rested wakefulness. So the way that Nathan analyzes data is to look at a measure of connectivity called integration, which is basically used to characterize the level of connectivity within as compared to between networks. And so this was achieved through calculating for each of the networks what is called a functional clustering ratio, which is basically the ratio between integration or connectivity within networks over connectivity between networks. And this allowed him to basically, and that's basically a method that was also used from Habib Sbenali work some years before, that allowed him to really look at integration versus segregation of cortical connectivity during the different conditions. And so he used this distribution of networks. So he used the 17 network model and set 57 clusters to look at this integration ratio. And basically what it means that when you have a higher clustering ratio, it means that you have a higher level of segregation. It means that your connectivity is more reduced to within network connectivity rather than between network connectivity. And studies have shown that, for example, in the descent from wakefulness to sleep, there's a higher clustering, and a higher segregation of cortical connectivity. And so he was looking at functional clustering ratio across these different tasks, comparing wakefulness to sleep deprivation. And during sleep deprivation, he observed an increase in this functional clustering ratio. An increased segregation of brain cortical connectivity. And during recovery nap, actually this clustering was even further increased, so more segregation. But then during the post-recovery period, the clustering ratio went down to a level that was intermediate between sleep deprivation and resting baseline. But the most interesting was to look at the relationships between those changes in the functional clustering ratio and the performance across the three tasks, both in accuracy and reaction times. And so on the upper panels, you see relationship between those changes from baseline to sleep deprivation, where you see that basically the higher the increase in functional clustering ratio was, the more impaired they were after sleep deprivation, both in terms of reaction time and accuracy. Conversely, if you look at the bottom panels here, if you look at the comparison between the sleep deprived state and the post-recovery nap, we saw that the more this clustering ratio decreased from sleep deprived to recovery, the more the performance improved, both in terms of accuracy and reaction times. So in other words, what it means is that not only is this functional clustering ratio strongly modulated by the vision state, the level of sleep deprived or recovered vigilance, but it is also strongly associated with the cognitive performances across the different domains that are usually affected by sleep deprivation, in such a way that actually what the study concludes is that those changes in brain integration might explain, at least in part, the changes in cognitive performances that we observed, and the variability in those changes, the vulnerability to those changes after sleep deprivation, and also the ability for people to recover after a short nap. So this concludes the more basic part of my talk. I know that I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to move on to the more clinical part of the talk, where I'm going to discuss the work that we've been doing on people with insomnia disorder. And I'm sure that you've been viewing this with my other colleagues on this panel, but just to remind you that insomnia disorder is defined by insomnia complaints associated with disruption of daytime function for at least 3 weeks and at least 3 months, 3 times per week and 3 months, despite the adequate opportunity for sleep and a good environment of sleep. So we've probably also reviewed that insomnia disorder is associated with a variety of comorbidities and economic impact due to the different consequences associated with insomnia. And what I wanted to really focus with you today is on cognitive deficits, because that's what I'm interested in. And I'm going to show you the results, also a study that was conducted by a postdoc Nathan Cross a couple of years ago, where we analyzed the data from the CLSA, which is the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. It is a large national cohort, consisted of, I think, 40,000 individuals right now, who are basically followed up over years with different assessments, not only questionnaires, but also physical examination, biological samples, and neuropsychological test value. And so to our greatest interest, these CLSA also includes questions that are specific to sleep and specific to different sleep disorders. And among the questions we had, there is questions about insomnia, and particularly not only insomnia complaints, but also daytime function, in such a way that within that sample, based on this question, we're able to distinguish people who had probable insomnia disorder, which means insomnia complaints with daytime function impairments for more than 3 weeks and for month per week and more than 3 months, based on the questions, self-report questions. Those who only had insomnia symptoms, so only the complaints of insomnia without the daytime function impairments or without the chronicity criterion, and those who are not complaining of insomnia symptoms. So this is a cohort of middle age to older individuals who are not having any cognitive diagnosis, cognitive disorders at baseline. And you see the distribution. The majority of them have non-insomnia symptoms, but 20% of them have insomnia symptoms, and 4% have probable insomnia disorder. And in the first analysis that we published 2 years ago, he was looking at the cross-section analysis to see if the presence of insomnia disorder was associated with higher cognitive dysfunction. And among the different cognitive function that was included in this cohort, the only one that was significantly modulated by the level of insomnia was memory test, actually the Ray verbal learning test, where people with chronic insomnia disorders had a lower performance, even after accounting for a variety of factors that might impact cognitive functions and that are listed here in the middle. So showing that insomnia disorder has some impacts on cognitive functions, and particularly on memory performances. Then with Nathan's and Jean-Louis Zhao, master student in my lab, we looked at the longitudinal study, the longitudinal data of the CLSA. After the baseline data collection, people are followed up, and here what it allowed us to do was to look at not only the presence of insomnia disorder symptoms, but how this change over time. So in such a way that we're able to basically divide people between those who remain non-insomniac over time, those who evolve to having insomnia symptoms only, and those who evolve to having insomnia disorder over this 3-year follow-up. And what we were interested was to look at whether these changes in insomnia status was associated with different changes in memory complaints, both from self-report, the physician diagnosis, and objective testing. And this is the result on the self-report and diagnosis and physician diagnosis, where you see that compared to the reference point of those who did not change their insomnia status, participants who developed probable insomnia disorder had much increased odds of having subjective complaints of memory worsening or the diagnosis of a memory problem by the physician, as you can see on the blue bars here. And this increase was was more significant and actually than those who only converted to having insomnia symptoms at the follow-up, where the difference is actually not present in terms of diagnosed memory problem by physician, and only slightly significant for subjective memory worsening. So participants who developed probable insomnia disorder over the follow-up showed higher odds of subjective memory decline compared to other groups, even after adjustment of comorbidities, but so adjusted for a bunch of comorbidities that are likely to influence cognitive functions. And we also looked at the way that those categories impacted the change in cognitive performances. And this is the example for change in memory performance using the Ray. As you can see, actually, we didn't observe any difference between groups in terms of Ray verbal learning test over the follow-up. But if we do divide this follow-up by sex, what we observe here that's very interesting is that while in women there doesn't seem to be any difference, in men there seems to be, there was a difference in such a way that men who developed probable insomnia disorder after the follow-up had a significant deterioration, significantly lower performance to the memory task compared to the other groups, which suggests that sex does have an impact on evolution of cognitive functions over time with insomnia disorder. So, so I show you how insomnia disorder impacts cognitive functions and impact also the cognitive, the changes in cognitive function over time with the possible implication of sex. Now I'm going to show you some data from our lab where we looked at insomnia treatments. As probably all of you know, it's the first line insomnia treatment for insomnia disorder is called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which includes a variety of strategies to correct dysfunctional beliefs and inadequate habits about sleep, and it's conducted over sessions with groups or individual therapies. And in this study that was conducted in collaboration with my collaborator Jean-Philippe Gouin and led by my postdoc Aurore Perrault and my research associate Florence Pomares, what we did was to look at, to run a randomized controlled trial where participants with insomnia disorder had either a CBTI program over 3 months or were in a waitlist control condition. And they were assessed both at baseline and after the intervention or the waitlist with a variety of testing, including self-report questionnaires, PSG, cognitive testing, and so the variables. So first, we confirmed that CBTI, that the sample was associated with an improvement of insomnia symptom, insomnia severity over time compared to waitlist. So we validated our intervention. We also observed that this was associated with improvement in different sleep diary metrics, including sleep efficiency. But what we were not able to observe was actually any significant changes with PSG sleep variables. And that's the example of sleep efficiency, for example, that did not improve over time. And that's not surprising because actually it's well known that CBTI has more effects on self-reported perception, self-reported sleep assessment than objective sleep assessment. But one thing we were particularly interested was actually to compare those objective variables and subjective variables, because as so probably all of you know, people with insomnia tend to have a quite significant misperception of the sleep time if you compare objective with the subjective variables. That's a concept called sleep misperception that you can calculate by comparing, for example, sleep diary and actigraphy, or in this case, you compare PSG with the self-report of their night spent in the lab. And at baseline, both groups significantly had underestimated their sleep time, for example, not surprisingly. But what was really interesting, we observed that after CBTI, there was a significant decrease in this misperception in such a way that subject in CBTI group didn't have a significant difference in terms of the perception between objective and subjective sleep time, while people in the waitlist group continue to maintain this misperception over time. So what we concluded is that not only CBTI improves subjective assessment of sleep, but also improve subjective perception of sleep by reducing discrepancy between subjective and objective measures, which I think is important to understand the physiological effects of CBTI. Now, what about cognitive functions, where we were not able to observe any change actually in either subjective or objective cognitive functions, but in this case, this study, we only measured cognitive function through the ANT task and the NBAC task. So what it means is that maybe it is to observe change in cognitive function would be required to have either more complex task, a longer follow-up, or maybe that the effects are just smaller and you have you need a higher sample to detect those changes. And then to finish, because I know I'm already at the end of my allotted time, we were interested really in the interaction between physical activity and sleep, because we know that physical activity does affect sleep, and studies have shown that exercise actually tends to improve sleep and even change sleep architecture. And most studies show benefits rather than impairments in terms of physical activity and sleep. And we know that both physical activity and sleep does have an important effect on cognitive performances. So in that study, what we did was to see if the combination of exercise before learning and nap after learning would, how that combination would affect memory recall. And so in this study, we had 4 groups of individuals, healthy young subjects. So one group had the exercise, which was 30 minutes of stationary bike at moderate intensity before learning and followed by nap. And basically the other groups, the control groups, had either the exercise or the nap, or none of those in the protocol, as you can see. And very briefly, to show you the results, what we observed, very interestingly, is that that's work conducted by my research associate, Mary Mogras. that the group who exercised before learning and then napped after had a significantly higher accuracy of recall of the items. This was a declarative memory task than the group that either only napped or only exercised, or the group that neither napped or exercised. So there was a significant interaction between exercise and nap on the performance. And very interestingly, when we're trying to look at the mechanism, what we observe is that in the group that exercise and nap, there was a positive correlation between the amount of spindles density during the nap and the accuracy of performance in such a way that it is possible that exercise might change sleep architecture during following nap, where those with higher spindle following the exercise might be better able to improve their accuracy of their memory recall after the nap. So this shows the synergy between exercise and nap in declarative memory performances and potential involvement of sleep spindles in this process. So this allows me to come back to my first studies linking spindles and memory consolidation. So in conclusion, I showed that sleep spindles promote the offline consolidation of memory traces, that sleep deprivation is associated with changes in brain integration, correlating with cognitive deterioration, that insomnia disorder is associated with worse memory in older adults and predicts self-reported cognitive worsening over time, and that CBTI improves self-reported sleep quality and decreases sleep misperception. And finally, I show you a study where we demonstrated an exercise sleep have a synergistic effect in the consolidation of memory traces. So this is the end of my talk. I'll obviously want to finish with acknowledging my team, because the work that was presented was done by this team, the fantastic team with all the research associates, postdoc fellows, grad students, and so a huge team of research community technologists, the funding agencies that allow this work, my collaborators across the different countries over there. And I also want to acknowledge, to advertise that we're still having an open position in my lab, a postdoc fellowship in imaging of sleep disorders. So if you know, or if you are interested yourself, please do not hesitate to contact me. And now, I don't know if I have time for questions, but if I have, I'm happy to take some.
Thank you very much, Tan. Do I have time for one very quick question, Isabel?
Yeah, we can do one, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That
was really interesting, a really, really lovely overview of what you've been up to. When you had the people with insomnia symptoms in the second part of your talk, you had people with insomnia symptoms who weren't affected in the same way as people with probable insomnia disorder. And I'd have thought maybe the insomnia symptoms might lead you to a similar place.
Yeah, so actually, I didn't have time to show you the full results, but if we do look at the results that were not corrected for all the other comorbidities, people with insomnia symptoms actually show also some deterioration of memory performance or decrease of memory over time. But when you do correct for the other comorbidities, it's only the insomnia disorder that persists. So it's definitely, there is some effect of insomnia symptoms, but not as strong as when those insomnia symptoms are chronic and have a daytime impact, function impairment. So that's and I think with this study I wanted to also we wanted to go beyond what's usually published in the cohort studies or epidemiological studies are usually only reporting the effect of sleep duration, nap behaviors, or a very broad measure of sleep quality. So, but if you are a clinician, you want to know if the patient that you see who has either insomnia symptoms or insomnia disorder does have a higher risk. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to treat a sleep duration or nap behavior. You want to treat a condition, so disorder. That's what we seem to what our results suggest, is that it does have an impact on performances. Hence, the interest of trying to treat insomnia to maybe protect brain health and prevent cognitive worsening with age.
Super. Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we'd better move on. I'll hand you back to Isabel. Thank you very much, Tan.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Dan, a lot for the presentation and for all your work. And now it's the turn of Dr. Sophia Eriksson, and now Matthew Brun will do the introduction to her. Thank you, Matthew, and Sophia, I think she's...
Thank you, Isabel. And thank you for the second great webinar you've organised today. So I'm Matthew Broom, I'm Director of the Institute for Mental Health here at the University of Birmingham, and work closely with Andy and Isabel on our kind of sleep and mental health research. So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, who's Dr. Sophia Eriksson. Sophia is Consultant Neurologist and Honorary Associate Professor at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and at University College London. She's the National Hospital's Clinical Lead for Epilepsy and Neurological Sleep Disorders, and in 2019 was elected to the Council of the Association of British Neurologists, and is a member of that body's expert panel for epilepsy and the European Academy of Neurology's scientific panel for sleep-wake disorders. In today's talk, Sophia will talk about her work on sleep and epilepsy. So welcome, Dr. Eriksson. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. So we're going to change tack a bit, doing something very much more clinical. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully that's going to be okay. Can people see that? Yeah, I see some nodding, so that's good. Yeah, thank you very much for asking me to talk today. So I think we got quite a mixed audience. So for some people this may be way too clinical, for some people it may be too basic. So if this is not relevant to you, now is the time to have the power nap, and then you will remember much more from the talks you've heard before mine. I have had some honoraria for educational activities from some drug companies, but none of this is really relevant to what I'm talking about today. And what I thought we were going to go through would be, what sleep disorders do we find in people with epilepsy, and how can we investigate these people, and what effects does epilepsy have on the sleep disorders, or the other way around, what effect does the sleep disorder have on epilepsy, and how can we treat this? And finally, just a tiny bit on effects on anesthesia, treatment on sleep and sleep disorders. So why are we talking about this in the first place? Well, sleep disorders are very common in people with epilepsy, and in my epilepsy clinic is one of the most common complaints here, apart from people having seizures. This is one of the things that people complain most commonly about, mainly is being tired. So excessive daytime somnolence is reported between 10 and nearly half of patients with epilepsy. As you can see from the numbers here, it varies enormously depending on what cohort of people you are looking at. And that's particularly the case for obstructive sleep apnea, where you can see that this is, for some cohorts, not very common at all, and others you can see up to 3/4 of people with epilepsy. I think this is really a very skewed number, and I don't think it's quite as high as that at all, but it has been reported. Restless symptoms has been reported between 18 and 35% of people with epilepsy, but not reviewed very commonly and not something that people tend to ask for. Whereas insomnia, as we all know, is common in many general population, and in people with disorders and chronic disorders such as epilepsy, and reported quite commonly as well. Going back to the first talk, what are the consequences of sleep disorders or sleep disruption? Well, it really does affect the quality of life. So if you look at people with epilepsy, so this is focal epilepsy here in the black bars, and the control subjects here in the white bars, you can see that if we're looking at the scale, just SF36, looking at a quality of life, that the people with epilepsy, they have a lower quality of life than control subjects, but that's clearer in people who have a disturbed sleep. Actually, it's quite clear, interesting that it's the case both for people who controls and have epilepsy, but it seems to be more pronounced in people with epilepsy than in people who have no sleep disorder. And the poor quality of life may, of course, be due to the sleep disorder and the potential psychiatric comorbidities associated with those. But it may also be that if you have a sleep disorder, that may worsen your seizure control. So what we did pre-pandemic actually was a group of people, a group of specialists we got together, and we were discussing, what can we do about this? Because I think it's something that, same as in medical school, we don't get much teaching on sleep disorders. We also don't spend very much time in clinic asking our epilepsy patients about their sleep and looking for potential sleep disorders. And I think under these circumstances, if you work in another field than epilepsy, I think just exchange epilepsy for some other condition. So if you talk to, identifying sleep disorders in people with diabetes, then ignore epilepsy and think that it's just diabetes. But I think you should ask people, start off with open questions, explore the sleep habits, and, if they find sleep non-restorative and if they are tired in the day. And if you find something, that someone says that, yes, they're snoring or they don't feel, well in the day, okay, then ask a bit more, in-depth questions about, possible pauses in the breathing, ask about restless leg symptoms. There are some questionnaires and diaries, but they're not overly helpful. And none of them, or rather, very few of them actually been validated for people with epilepsy. If you find a sleep disorder, then obviously you'd investigate them as you would if they were if they didn't have epilepsy or any other disorder. And we'll go back to talking about that. If you find a sleep disorder, then obviously you treat that. But everyone, I think you should discuss sleep hygiene. And for epilepsy patients, I think you should try to optimize their anti-seizure medication. Is there something that makes them specifically tired, or the more sedating medication? Avoid giving that in the morning or give a high dose in the evening. So what should you be asking? Well, you can ask with some, not necessarily have to go through all of these questions in clinic, but just ask a little bit about their sleep habits, when they go to bed and wake up, how many hours sleep they might get per night, if there's any snoring, pauses in the breathing, if they feel tired in the day, but also ask about insomnia symptoms, both difficulties falling and staying asleep, and difficulties getting up in the morning and feeling refreshed. And if they have a bed partner, then clearly that's useful to know if there's some movements during the night, or if there's some suggestion of parasomnia with unusual behaviors, or possibly even seizures during the night. As I mentioned, there are some scales. So you got the typical scales where you look at the sleep and sleepiness, but you can also look at restless leg scales and the different sleep apnea scales, keeping in mind that only this SDQ is validated for people with epilepsy, but potentially use a lower cutoff than for the general population. The objective testing is the same as for people who don't have epilepsy, so inpatient polysomnography or even home polysomnography that we have just started doing, both to look for any sleep disordered breathing, periodic limb movements, but also see if there are seizures at night, and particularly if someone has poorly controlled epilepsy. I think this is really important, and then you'd need to have an extended or full head EEG to see if there are any seizures happening during the night. For excessive daytime somnolence, you can of course do multiple sleep latency test or maintenance of wakefulness test. And Tan mentioned actigraphy, so where you would look at sleep patterns, so looking more at rest and activity to know, do people give themselves sufficient sleep opportunity or not spend enough time in bed. For people with epilepsy, it's an enormous amount of reason why they can be tired. I think insufficient sleep is probably the most common reason I see for sleepiness in my sleep clinic, actually. But even so for people with epilepsy. And I guess if you think about yourself, how much sleep have you got this last week? Perhaps not enough, and perhaps that's why you are feeling a bit tired when you join in a webinar. But there may be other comorbidities. There may be depression. There may be pain that they need treatment for or may disrupt sleep. But there may be comorbid sleep disorders. There may be seizures during the night. There may be intracranial epileptiform activity, and Anya might tell you that that can interfere with your sleep and your sleep architecture. Anti-seizure medication can make you sleepy in the day, or can sometimes cause insomnia. And as I mentioned with the comorbidities, of course, depression is a very common reason for poor sleep or daytime somnolence. I already mentioned the potential consequences of sleep disruption, that's reduced quality of life, but it can also be sleepiness in the day. Following on from the previous talk, problems with memory, so cognitive slowing and learning, difficulties with learning and remembering. There's some suggestion that sleep disruption, or particularly sleep apnea, associated with increased cardiovascular risks and increased risk-taking behavior, particularly if affecting your frontal lobes. But specifically for epilepsy patients, this may be precipitating factors for seizures, where it can go in a bit of a vicious circle where sleep fragmentation and sleep deprivation lead to a lower seizure threshold. That in turn leads to seizures that disrupts someone's overnight sleep. So how can we manage our epilepsy patients with excessive daytime somnolence? First thing, here, as for everyone who's sleeping the day, make sure that they have enough and adequate nighttime sleep. We need to ask about sleep hygiene. We need to ask, what times do people go to bed? Are they watching YouTube clips before they go to bed? Do they have messages that ping across middle of the night, or notifications that wake them up during the night? And you can use leaflets or digital resources to enforce or just highlight good sleep hygiene. For epilepsy patients and other conditions, I think you need to rule out that there's some sleep fragmentation. That may be by seizures, or it could be by other sleep disorders. And you will investigate, as we discussed before, either with inpatient or home polysomnography, and identify and treat sleep disorders if you find any. If the somnolence continues despite your best efforts, then I think you need to look at the anti-seizure medication. How can you optimize this? So taking the more sedating drugs at bedtime, or looking at other drugs as well. And for sure, I've had some patients where I've had to change their anti-seizure medication because they've been too tired in the day by the drugs that I've been prescribing them. Just briefly about sleep apnea. Here I've put in that it's can be seen in about 10% of epilepsy patients. As I showed you on the first slide, it varies significantly between cohorts. It seems to be more common in people with refractory epilepsy, so difficult to treat epilepsy, but overall risk factors are the same as in the general population, so male gender, older age, and obesity. But for sure, sleep apnea can fragment sleep, give sleep deprivation that can then trigger seizures. And people have actually been looking at treating, or rather what happens to epilepsy when they treat sleep apnea. So there was a small study that they were doing to assess effectiveness of CPAP. So for the patient population who had therapeutic CPAP, there was a larger proportion of people who've had 50% seizure reduction than those who had sham CPAP, and same goes for the ones who were seizure-free. In this other study, they looked at spike counts on a night on the polysomnography before and after they started CPAP. So this was sort of randomized and people wear their own controls, but you can see that the spike count goes down from baseline to when they're CPAP treated, to suggest that, improving sleep and reducing sleep fragmentation with CPAP improves seizure control. And for some of my refractory epilepsy patients, this may actually be one of their best treatment options, if we do find sleep apnea, as they might have limited or less good chances of improving their epilepsy with trying another drug. We know less about people who've got periodic limb movements or restless leg symptoms. And here there have been no control trials to look at how restless leg may affect seizures in the way that we've seen with sleep apnea. But we kind of treat them on the assumption that sleep fragmentation from periodic limb movements may be bad here as well as for sleep apnea. It's worth remembering that some anti-seizure medication, such as topiramate and zonisamide, have been associated with some case reports of restless leg symptoms. And incredibly important, if you ever see anyone with restless leg symptoms, is to check ferritin, not just hemoglobin. And if ferritin is below 75, so we used to say 50, but now actually I say 75, supplement with iron. You should avoid or reduce caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. That can make restless leg symptoms worse, and probably periodically movements as well. Some anti-seizure medications, pregabalin and gabapentin, can treat both restless legs and periodically movements, and may be worth considering them if you're looking for another drug to try. About insomnia, no questionnaires are validated in patients with epilepsy, and you'd use the same criteria as in the general population. I think you heard from Tan before what that is. Here you can see insomnia associated with greater impairment of quality of life and more depressive symptoms than for epilepsy patients who don't have insomnia. And that may be, actually they've seen that insomnia is more frequently seen in epilepsy patients who've got poor seizure control, if they're on lots of epilepsy medication, and also if they have developmental delay, so intellectual disabilities. And some of my patients will have seizures from sleep only. And I think in that group of people, lots of the time people are really worried about going to bed and going to sleep because they know that they might be at risk of having a seizure. So it kind of leads to a bit of a vicious circle, not wanting to go to bed, difficulties falling asleep, giving sleep deprivation, and then increasing risk of seizures. So difficult for this group of patients. I'm not sure that I need to tell you more about the psychiatric consequences of insomnia. You will hear, and you've already heard more about this, but it's definitely associated with development of psychiatric symptoms later on in life if you have insomnia. And interestingly, treating depression doesn't necessarily improve insomnia, but if you have insomnia and depression and treat insomnia, that can actually improve depression, suggesting quite an interesting relationship between the two. How do we manage poor sleep? Well, again, optimize nighttime sleep. Here, also incredibly important to discuss sleep hygiene advice, although my colleagues who do CBT tell me that sleep hygiene on its own is pretty useless. I'll still try to mention the obvious potential triggers to patients. Again, you need to rule out nighttime fragmentation, and particularly by seizures then. So going back to my group with nocturnal seizures, just to double check, are they actually having seizures from sleep that disrupt their sleep and wake them up from sleep that they may or may not be aware of? Are the restless leg symptoms that stop them falling asleep or wake them up during the night? And obviously you treat that if you find it. If you still have insomnia, you optimize your drugs, but again, you wouldn't want to forget the CBT for insomnia, looking at other medications and trying to optimize that as well as your anti-seizure medication. So yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, usual first line. Hypnotics can be used, and you'd use the same criteria as in the general population. Very, very briefly, at the end, effect of anti-seizure medication on sleep. There may actually be some beneficial effects, and that can be direct effects. So improving sleep and sleep architecture. And here I'm particularly thinking about drugs like gabapentin and pregabalin that have been shown to increase overnight deep sleep. But it can be indirect by reducing seizures or reducing EEG abnormalities that may improve their sleep architecture. It can be effect on behavior, less worried about seizures and less worried about going to sleep, and improve quality of life, obviously, if you have an improved seizure control. Anti-seizure medication can, of course, also have side effects and worsen your sleep. So insomnia, for example, lamotrigine has been associated with insomnia, but daytime somnolence is clearly very common in people with epilepsy taking anti-epileptic drugs. So just to sum up, people with epilepsy have a higher risk of poor quality sleep and sleep disorders. I think you should ask, and here you should substitute epilepsy for whatever you work with. You should ask about sleep and sleep habits in clinic, because I think here you can actually, do people a good service by improving their sleep. And the seizure treatment should be optimized to improve sleep and avoid daytime sleepiness. And if you find, or if you suspect a comorbid sleep disorder, you should look into that and you should treat it if you find any disorders. And with that, I'm going to stop and take questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Eriksson. A very clear and well-timed talk. So thank you so much for that. We have a few minutes for questions. If any colleagues would like to put them in the Q&A. I'll give that a moment for people to type in. I had oh, Andy's got one, so maybe I'll jump to Andy for using my chair's prerogative. Andy, you'd like to ask a question?
I would like to ask a question, but you could go first. But, since you passed over.
I mean, I think Sophia kind of preempted my question in the talk slightly. As you were talking, Sophia, I was intrigued by what I could see a kind of, phobic anxiety developing in some of these people about the thought of going to sleep. And then you alluded to it, I think, in maybe your third or fourth slide from the end, about the fear of seizure, meaning they link bed to seizure and then not being able to sleep. And I just wondered how you have managed to sort of break that connection in people's minds. And then also you commented on my second thought, which was that would there then be a theoretical link between seizure threshold in the daytime being impacted on if there was sleep deprivation? So I'd be grateful for your thoughts about the success of, I guess, CBT and other interventions in breaking that.
So I think it's really difficult for people, lots of people having, anxiety about having seizures, not just in their sleep, but in the day as well. And we do often have great help from our psychologists and our psychiatry colleagues. I'm incredibly lucky here at UCLH that we have an insomnia clinic run by psychiatrists, and I often refer to them. But what I try to do when people have overnight seizures is obviously try to improve the seizures as much as I can, although my cohort of people with refractory epilepsy seems to be increasing year on year. Hopefully not a sign that I'm just a rubbish clinician, but perhaps just that but the ones who tend to stay on in my clinic. But for sure, if I'm trying to dodge that question further, going on to the second part of your question, if you have poor nighttime sleep and you're sleep deprived, yes, you're at more at risk of having seizures during the day. Okay. That's, the TMS studies have shown increased cortical excitability following sleep deprivation.
Thank you. My quick follow-up before I hand over to Andy Sphere, but I guess the other thing we saw in lockdown, obviously sleep impairments happening quite commonly in the general population, and perhaps a suspicion people were self-medicating with alcohol and cannabis and what have you as kind of street hypnotics, for want of a better word. Do any of your patient group use sort of self-management techniques if they're struggling like that? I'm sure they do. They may not tell me about it, but I'm sure they do. Yeah. Thank you. I'll hand over to Andy for his question.
Thanks, Sophia. That was really interesting. I wonder, we heard in the first talk today that people with psychosis were very open and enthusiastic about sleep interventions. And I just wondered what your experience of people with epilepsy in a similar context was. I mean, I think that you've made a clear case that there are plenty of sleep problems. Are people enthusiastic about addressing those problems? Most of the time, I think they are. And again, as I said, alluded to that my cohort of people that I see often have very refractory epilepsy. And that often means that they might have perhaps less good chance of improving seizure control if I do a change of the medication, or I've come to the line, I've tried everything, I've tried 12 anti-epileptic drugs, we're going nowhere. If we look at things from a different perspective, this gives me actually an additional way of treating people or improving control. So, for example, if someone is overweight, possibly it's my fault for putting them on valproate and pregabalin, but they may be snoring during the night. If we find that they have sleep apnea, then treating with CPAP, I think, is the best option. And I think people are quite intrigued to hear that, it's a different way of looking at this, and I might actually get better from something else. So I think, people are keen and interested
in treating sleep disorders.
Great, thank you. So I think that brings us back on schedules, Isabel, so I may close that session there if that's all right. So thank you so much, Sophia, for your excellent talk, very clear overview and very helpful to me as a clinician as well. Lots of things I forget with my patients with psychosis. So thank you so much indeed for your contribution today.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Thanks.
My pleasure, thank you. So back to Isabel. Cheers, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Sophia and Matthew for the introduction, and Sophia for an excellent talk. And now is the turn of Professor Mark Weisbluth. So thank you very much, Mark. I see you that you are there. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
That's perfect. Yeah.
All right. Well, this is my very webinar, so smoothly. If not, Isabel will take over.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mark. So then I will introduce Mark Weisbluth to everyone. Second. Sorry. 1 second, problem with my computer. Yes, so Professor Mark Weisbluth is Professor Emeritus of Clinical Pediatrics at Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago. Professor Weisbluth is a world-leading researcher on sleep and children, and he founded the original Sleep Disorder Center at Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Mark discovered that sleep is linked to temperament, and he coined the now familiar phrase sleep training to describe his methods for helping children learn how to fall asleep. So Professor Mark Weisbluth is the father of sleep research in children and the reference for all of us who are currently working on child sleep research. So thank you very much, Mark, for accepting my invitation today here. And today, Mark will talk about why healthy sleep in children is so important, and more specifically, how sleep difficulties in children can lead to mental health problems. So
Thank
now, Mark, so sorry for
let me see if I now can do what you instructed me to do.
Yes. So then now you can now share this, share your presentation. Yeah. Yeah, this is working. This is the important. Yeah.
Is it working?
It's working. It's great.
So the
now
topic today is
sometimes it's the most difficult part. So then, so now we can just
impaired.
start with the fun part. So then this is like around 20 minutes, and then we'll go for the Q&A at the end. Okay, Mark. Thank you very much.
The topic is, does impaired sleep in children cause mental health problems in children? And what I'm going to do is show many slides summarizing studies that looked at this problem. I will not read the slides because I have so many and we have such a short time, but I will make some comments about the slides, and then we'll have time at the end for questions regarding these studies or any other questions that you might have. These slides are available in my book, Healthy Sleep Habits, Happy Child, and also on my website, which is markweisbluth.com. So the evidence supporting an association between sleep and mental health in children comes from 3 types of study designs, which you can read. The advantage of the cross-sectional designs is that you can have very large numbers of children and make observations that would not be easily obtained in other kinds of studies. For example, we know that among lower SES families, there are more sleep problems associated with more mental health problems. The problem with cross-sectional studies is common method variance. In most of them, mothers are serving as the same reporter for both the child's sleep problems or sleep schedules and issues of mood, behavior, emotional status. I'm going to let you read these studies. I'll pause and then make comments about them. In study 1, the internalizing behaviors were described as social withdrawal and appearing or feeling sad, lonely, nervous, or fearful. In study 2, the externalizing behaviors are described as anger, aggression, or tantrums. Study 3 highlights the importance of sleep timing and not just sleep duration. In study 5, poor sleep quality means a long latency to sleep, long wake times after sleep onset, and negative affect was described as feeling hostile, irritable, ashamed, guilty, distressed, upset, or scared. Throughout these slides, I'll be starting with the younger children first and then going to older children. There are many longitudinal studies of children, and they have the opportunity to look at sleep problems and mental health problems to see what occurs first, or what other factors, risk factors, might be causing both sleep problems and mental health problems. But again, in longitudinal studies in children, we have the problem of common method variance. In study 1, there was a dose-response relationship between parental behaviors and children's sleep. At the first month, every child had a parent present when their child fell asleep on more than 3 nights a week, but sleep problems developed only when the frequency of parental presence at sleep onset increased to 5 or 6 times a week. In study 3, the sleep problems were difficulty falling asleep and night waking. Are you able to read these slides even though my pictures are covering them? Yes. All right. In study 4, there was no significant contemporary association between sleep and attention regulation or behavioral problems at age 3 to 4. This study raises the question whether sleep disruption at an early age interferes with brain maturational properties that later result in compromised regulatory capabilities. Study 6 showed a dose-response relationship between shorter sleep duration and more mental health problems. Also, this study showed that measurements of emotional and behavioral health problems at baseline did not predict sleep durations at 15 months. Additionally, this study suggests that helping children sleep better helps prevent the development of mental health problems because compared with children who decreased or had no change in night sleep duration, those children who actually increased their night sleep duration over the 15-month study period had a decrease in measurements of hyperactivity and attention, conduct problems, and they had better peer relations and more prosocial behavior. In study 8, sleep disturbances at age 10 were not related to white matter microstructure. This is another example of a study suggesting that childhood sleep disturbances have long-term effects on brain maturational processes. In study 10, the effect of non-regular bedtimes was cumulative. The more years of non-regular bedtimes, the worse the behavior, suggesting a dose-response relationship. However, when children changed from non-regular to regular bedtimes, they showed improvements in their behavior. This study suggests that when parents help their children sleep better, future potential behavioral difficulties can be prevented. Study 11 highlights the clinical importance of small differences in sleep duration in affecting mental health outcomes. In study 12, internalizing behaviors at each assessment did not predict sleep problems. In study 13, emotional problems did not predict sleep problems, sleep durations at any age. Unlike other studies that used parent reports or self-administered questionnaires to assess mental health problems, this study used professional clinical interviews. Also, short sleep was defined as only 30 minutes less than the mean duration for that age group, again, highlighting the clinical importance of small differences in sleep durations in affecting mental health outcomes. In study 16, although late bedtimes were associated with shorter night sleep, short night sleep did not predict emotional distress. This study highlights the importance of sleep timing and not just sleep duration. Please tell me if I'm going too fast.
It's going perfect, no worries.
The remaining studies I'm going to describe are experimental studies. Experimental studies, of course, objectively measure cause and effect relationships, but often their small and homogeneous samples limit the ability to generalize their findings. In study 2, for the no nap challenge with the unsolvable puzzle, the children were less able to understand that something was wrong with the puzzle, less able to admit that they were unable to complete the task. They engaged in more thumb sucking, hair twirling, lip or nail biting. They were more visually fixated on the misfit piece and more incorrectly insistent that they had completed the puzzle. Also, for the no nap challenges, with the solvable puzzle, the nap-deprived children showed less joy and pride when completed. Study 3 strongly suggests that when parents help their children sleep better, their temperament improves. Study 4 highlights the clinical importance of small differences in sleep duration in affecting mental health outcomes. Studies 7 and 9 highlight the clinical difference, the clinical importance of small differences in sleep duration in affecting mental health outcomes. Only 15 minutes in study 7 and 13 minutes in study 9 had a significant clinical effect. Studies 10, 11, and 12 highlight the importance of very small differences in sleep duration in affecting mental health outcomes. In study 14, the children spent 10 nights in a sleep lab to objectively monitor sleep opportunity. All of these adolescents were selected in part because they were good sleepers, sleeping more than 8 hours a night. The first 2 nights of baseline sleep, they were given 10 hours of sleep opportunity. And the last 2 nights of recovery, they were also given 10 hours of sleep opportunity. Group A had 5 hours of sleep opportunity on nights 3 through 8. And group B had 7.5 hours of sleep opportunity on nights 3 through 8. Group C served as a control and had 10 hours of sleep opportunity on all nights. Looking at group A, sleep restriction increased negative mood and decreased positive mood on nights 3 through 8. 2 nights of sleep recovery on nights 9 to 10 were not sufficient to recover from increased negative mood states, although recovery occurred for positive mood states. Now look at group C. And remember, all of these were well-rested adolescents going into the study. They slept more than 8 hours each night before the study. But when given the opportunity to obtain even more sleep, those children in group C exhibited increased happiness, both on nights 3 through 8 compared to baseline, and on nights 9 to 10 compared to the sleep restriction nights 3 through 8. Obtaining optimal sleep increased happiness in group C by more than 10% over the course of the study. I discovered the association between temperament and sleep in a group of infants 4 months old, and showed that those with an easy temperament had significantly longer sleep durations than those with a difficult temperament. I again studied the identical group of children at age 3 years and observed the same findings. Easy temperament children slept longer than children with a difficult temperament. I divided the 4-month-old infants into 4 groups. Those that were easy at 4 months and remained easy at 3 years. Those who had been difficult at 4 months, but had an easy temperament at age 3 years. And similarly, the easy children who became more difficult, and the difficult children who remained with a difficult temperament at 3 years. And you can see by the rank ordering of total sleep duration at 3 years that this supports my belief that when parents are able to put forth the effort to help their child sleep better, it improves their temperament. This was a very old study, but a more modern study showed that in children 2 to 13 years, when given a mobile app that helped the parents help their children sleep better, at follow-up, caregivers reported fewer moderate severe sleep problems, improved child sleep patterns, and better temperament. The percentage of caregivers rating the child as more difficult than average decreased from 51 to 36%. So when parents help their child sleep better, they'll tend to make their child temperamentally easier, more positive mood, less intense, more adaptable, more approaching. For those of you who are parents, you can ask yourself, what is the magical power of a nap that turns a raving, ranting, manic, and out-of-control toddler into a sweet Prince Charming? So all the studies agree that all children at every age who are not sleeping well are at a higher risk for adverse mental health outcomes. Many studies highlight the clinical importance of small differences in sleep duration in affecting mental health outcomes. Many studies show that when parents help their child sleep better, future potential mental health issues can be prevented. Some studies show a dose-response relationship. The worse the sleep issue, the greater the mental health problem. A few studies suggest that sleep disruptions at early age interferes with brain maturational processes that later are associated with mental health concerns. That concludes my talk, and I'm willing to take questions from anyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you much, Mark. So thank you for such an excellent talk. And so now we'll have, and as well, like great time because it's everything on time. So then you just hit like the 20 minutes. So then now we have around like 10 minutes for Q&A. Yeah, I have a question. So better because some of the attendees raised the hands, but it's better if you leave the questions in the Q&A and then I can read them. So in the meantime, so I have a question. I mean, I guess this is kind of this, so my research, as you know, Mark, so it's one of my main areas is focused on child sleep and how it's related to mental health problems. And basically, so there are different approaches how to target the sleep problems. And so one of my main concerns, so in research, but as well like in clinical practice and on all your experience, what you have seen. So is it so, especially the first studies that you were showing to us, so then usually what we see in this type of research is, okay, sleeping, for example, in 8 months is related to, I don't know, internalizing problems of sleep at 24 months is related. So I have done that. And basically we see like many associations with different time points, but do you consider that it might be more the persistence of the sleep problems that later might lead to mental health problems, or are there some critical periods of the development stages that are a higher risk? So this is important for research, but honestly, as well as a mother of, of a small child. So sometimes I think you just get as well paranoid. So, okay, what is kind of more relevant? So based on your experience, what you think about this?
So neuroscientists often like to use the phrase critical time periods, during which, if something occurs regarding sleep, maybe the brain will be adversely affected. And of course, in the ethology literature, we know about critical time periods, for example, with imprinting. But there's no literature to suggest that there is a critical time period clinically in infant sleep maturation that suggests if something is not going on correctly at that time with the child's sleep, then adverse consequences will occur. It would seem that throughout the child's lifespan, the more severe, the more chronic sleep problems exist, the more likely you're going to have adverse outcomes. But there are plenty of studies also that show enormous reversibility, so that when parents improve the child's sleep, those problems disappear. So it's a matter of degree, and I don't think there's good scientific evidence to suggest that there's a critical period, which is especially important for parents to be focused on sleep. I think the focus on sleep should be throughout the child's lifetime.
Thank you very much. We have now one question in the Q&A. Thank you for the talk. It really emphasized the importance of how little adjustments to sleep can improve mental health outcomes. What scares me the most is that the school times are early and teens aren't getting enough sleep. What would take education system to shift to later start times to improve the mental health outcome of teens? So yeah,
the history of changing school start times shows that it comes from the parents in the community who advocate for it, not from school boards or educators. they are always reluctant to make these changes because of the complexity of readjusting their bus schedule to accommodate middle schools' bus schedules, high schools' bus schedules, elementary school bus schedules. In addition, they complain about the later start time affecting academic outcomes, especially among lower SES kids. And coaches complain that it adversely impacts upon their athletic programs at the end of the school day. So there's a lot of resistance in changing school start times from the school. And in communities where this has occurred, it's been the parents' advocacy that has led to the changes. Mm-hmm. But the changes are very dramatic. In a county near Washington, D.C., they showed that when they changed the school start time, not only was there better academic performance, better mental health outcomes, but in this county, and only in this county in the state of Virginia, were there fewer teen automobile accidents. So it's a very strong suggestion that, and it occurred after this change was implemented. So it has a lot of health benefits beyond mental health benefits.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's kind of difficult change because it's kind of a system change, but I can imagine, especially with the study that you saw with these 10 hours.
The good news is that the state of California has mandated a change to occur in the next calendar year for middle school and high school. So when it's done locally, there's always resistance, but some states like California have made this change.
Yeah. Andy, you have a question, and then we have one Q&A. So I think we're done. We could finish. Andy, yep.
Thanks, and thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I just wondered about some of these very small increments of sleep, kind of, 5 minutes or 10 minutes can have a significant impact, and whether you're surprised by how small these increments can be and actually have a measurable effect.
So the researchers who have reported this were surprised themselves. And because there's so many studies like this, I'm not surprised to find future studies to find this to be the case. And what happens is, in young children, it's accomplished by moving the bedtime slightly earlier. In your preteens and teens, it's by moving the school start time a little bit later. And I've had the experience as a clinician meeting parents who had a variety of reasons why they would not want to change their behavior at night with regard to signal night wakings, but were willing to move the bedtime 10 or 20 minutes earlier. They could make that adjustment, and that set them on a path to correct longstanding severe sleep problems such as bedtime resistance and signal night wakings and long latency to sleep. So a few minutes earlier bedtime in young children make a world of difference in terms of latency to sleep, bedtime resistance, signal night wakings. And there's a lot of research studies that do not talk about bedtimes, but they talk about bedtime routine frequency, bedtime routine consistency, sleep-related maternal cognitive biases. And when researchers have reanalyzed their data at my request, they have shown that the improvements were more related to an early bedtime than these other factors. So a slightly earlier bedtime is an unappreciated health benefit for children, and it doesn't have to be hours. It can be measured in a few minutes.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question in the Q&A. Thank you for your talk, Professor. Is sleep more effective than medication for the treatment of mood disorders in children in your experience? Do you think children are being over-medicated?
I'm a pediatrician, not a child psychiatrist.
I know.
So I can't answer the direct question as you posed it. But we do know that when children who are being medicated for ADHD, for example, are sleeping better, they're more improved. They still may need their medicine, but it's an adjunct therapy to help them sleep better. On the obverse is also true. On their medication, when they're not sleeping well, their performance is impaired. So it's not the direct relationship between things like sleep disturbances and ADHD are debatable, but it's a contributing factor in many children. There's no question about that. Whether it's biologically based or parent involved, is probably both, and it varies from child to child. Regarding over-medication, that's a bit of a loaded question. In lower SES families in the United States, there are both examples of large numbers of children who are under-medicated due to inadequate access to medical care, who have ADHD, okay? There are also examples, though, in some communities where a willing pediatrician or school authority or somewhere where children are over-medicated for chemical classroom behavioral management. And there are areas, again, these are not, it's not a uniform distribution. There are areas in the country where you'll find communities among higher SES families where they're way over-medicated for perceived mental health problems. So it's mixed.
Yep. Thank you. So I think we don't have any more questions. I don't know if Mark, you want to discuss something else with us, because I mean, now that we have you here, or if not, we can just end the session as you prefer.
How much more time do I have?
Well, you could have, I guess, like the whole the whole day. I mean, we are just, well, this is just the end of the webinar, but I don't know if there is kind of like maybe like just few kind of lines of recommendations that maybe you would like us to give to the new parents. Well, we have a question. But
The association between mental health outcomes, academic outcomes, and sleeping problems is below the radar of most parents. Most parents have a heightened concern about nutrition and later academic success as the child gets older. They may have a very strong concern about exercise, but quality sleep as a benefit for the brain is not appreciated. The United States of America, Department of the Army, 1 year ago, came out with a new manual designed to train civilians to become soldiers. And this manual is to instruct the soldier trainers on how to transform the civilian into a soldier during what would be called basic training or boot camp. And chapter 11 of this manual is on sleep readiness. And they emphasize how important sleep is for soldiering. But everything they say about the superior soldiers could be translated into parents, and everything they say about the recruits, the trainees, could be said about children. And over they emphasize that while every organ of the body requires oxygen, glucose, it's only the brain that has a requirement for sleep. So the idea in my book and my website is that sleep is vitally important for brain health. But people, that's not something that's commonly accepted or commonly perceived. We all know the factors that are important for heart health, like we don't smoke cigarettes, we try not to be overweight. We know the importance of clean water due to the tragedies of Flint, Michigan, and other locales. We know the importance of clean air, but we don't appreciate the sleep contribution to brain health. And it's probably because it's not commercialized. The diet industry, the exercise industry, these industries are very important for commercial reasons to promote dieting, exercise, fitness. But there's not a lot of money to be made off by promoting brain health. So when a lot of popular press articles and media events occurred talking about sleeping, about 95% of them focus only on adults. And the antecedents of adult sleep problems, of course, often begins in childhood. But this is not appreciated by the general population.
And I think like in these last sentences, I think like summarizing it very well, like the whole webinar, and I think like the purpose of what we're trying to do, right? So I think like highlight like the relevance of sleep and how it affects like every single parts of our body and of our life. So thank you very much. So thank you very much, Mark, to all
You're very
the
welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
speakers during these two sessions. Thank you very much as well, Andy, you stayed there, and Matthew for co-hosting. And I hope this will be like the continuation and many more like discussions about how sleep is so relevant. And thank you for all the attendees during these two sessions. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.